Today on the PIO podcast, we'd like to welcome Matthew Oleniuk. He's the risk strategist from the Risk Insider. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Thanks so much, Robert. Great to be here.
First, Matt, can you tell our listeners and our viewers about your background? Let's hear how you got into the field and what you're doing.
Yeah, well, it was a long and winding path, I guess you could say. For the first half of my career, it was pretty international. I bounced around between a lot of different countries, to be quite honest. UK, Australia, New Zealand, even South Korea. Mix of public and private sector work, but mostly within project management and client services. And so I'm originally from Canada. At a certain point, I went back to Canada and found myself in Ottawa, the capital. And of course, government's the biggest game in town there. So I naturally fell into the industry. And from there, I kind of stumbled backwards into kind of risk and audit specialization. I had no previous background in that. As I said, it was all about project delivery, client services, front facing. But I was developing a development program for the internal audit community within the federal public service. After doing that for about a year or two, some opportunities opened up. I said, well, I'll jump on the other side of the tracks and see how things are over there. And I ended up sticking with it for the next 15 years or so. So apart from a brief spell providing formal oversight over major transformation projects across the government for a couple of years, apart from that, it was mostly within internal audit and rising to a chief audit executive. And just the nature of the job, because all of the eyes were always fixed on these. A lot of our work had to do with projects, and so then once I finally decided to kind of forge my own path, I ended up coming over to the UAE. I set up a business in Dubai here. It was a natural fit for me to talk about project. Now, I didn't want to go back to the audit community. My real target here is senior public sector leaders. Because one of the elements that I always found kind of frustrating, having lived in both worlds, is that there's very little, common language between them. It's almost like a communications PIO interface within the departments and agencies that they're talking two separate languages. And what matters to one group doesn't matter to another. And one of the biggest frustrations for me was when we're talking about projects and what could derail them, what could bring them down, it shouldn't just be kind of a paper exercise. And that's how project delivery is often managed. Let's talk about risk in a compliance sense. But I'm talking about risk.
Let's talk about this.
Okay.
So let's before we jump into that, for 15 years you were in public service, and so what kinds of internal project failures did you see snowball into full-blown public crises?
Well, I mean, to be honest, a heck of a number of them. There are a couple that pop out, but the one that really sticks out for a lot of Canadian public servants, because it's still kind of ongoing, is the Phoenix project. This was meant to be a transformation of a replacement of the old internal human resources and financial services, mostly on the human resources side. This was budgeted about $300 million, was meant to be spent about 4 or 5 years. It's ballooned to about $4 billion. It's about 10 years old now, and it needs to be completely replaced. Now, one of the biggest issues, and this is one of the areas where I think your audience really comes into this, is that the project tried to keep it contained. And kind of, when we talk about the 5 stages of grief, denial is always the first one. Yeah. And that was true for at least a year after it was quite obvious that this was a mistake, or at least there were serious errors behind in the project. And that puts a lot of communications, public information officers at quite a handicap, because if the project itself is saying it's not a big problem, we've got it under control, it's just a speed bump, and the public as well as the users are screaming that it's a heck of a lot more than that, and there is that disconnect, and nobody's satisfied there.
So would that be one of those internal issues that catch communicators or the communications team by surprise, is because you have the executives not giving all the details, and then you have the public, which we all know there's always those people in the public that file freedom of information requests for information, especially when they see millions of dollars being spent, or in some cases billions. They want to know where their money's going. So now you have the two at opposing ends, and then you got the guys in the middle, the communications team, that's going, okay, what do we do?
Yeah, and it's such a challenge because that senior leadership, they really want the templates, right? They want the generic statements that give a hint of providing information, but rarely actually say anything meaningful. And so those who are kind of faced with answering the questions are in a bind. There are those gaps between the teams, but it really, in a lot of senses, it feels like kind of a canary in a coal mine, anyways, because a lot of the messages being pushed up by project teams are, in fact, very controlled and very kind of narrative driven, and it gets very difficult for senior leaders pretty much in any area to get a sense of how things are going on. And it's not manipulative or anything. It's just the way the system is designed. It's just let's push out information according to these pockets, these kind of controlled little columns that we've designed, and hopefully that tells a good enough picture without actually stepping back to say, have we answered real questions here?
Right, right. How, Matt, for PIOs in government, what are some of the early warning signs that a project might be headed for trouble?
I would say if a PIO, again, even with that template environment, they'll often ask, "What are some challenges ahead, or what are some risks?" They like to sometimes sprinkle. And if they can't get a really satisfactory answer to that, I think that that's a clue to push for a lot more information. What I would love is for senior level PIOs to actually be a part of some of those, maybe not every, maybe not a permanent member of the committee, but at least some of those oversight committees to get a sense of what's going on, to get a sense of what could be interpreted. Because one of the hallmarks of the project management culture within a lot of federal public service agencies is, you're in the project team. And so you feel that you have a sense of control. And so whatever messages we're sending out are as minimal as possible. But PIOs don't have that luxury sometimes, right?
Right. No, they don't.
Having
In many organizations, right. And many organizations, the PIOs, the senior PIOs are in they're in those leadership roles and they are on the inside, but there are so many, especially in the government sector and a lot of these organizations, they're much farther down and they're the ones that see the day-to-day stuff coming in
Mhm.
from the public asking questions, and that doesn't filter down to the lower. I look at like a lot of federal government employees or communications people, they're all public affairs specialists. They're not the communications directors of the organization. So the feed from up here has got to come down to those line level public affairs specialists as well.
Yeah, and part of it is really structural. Some of these government projects are so big and there are so many stakeholders involved that it becomes almost impossible to have free-flowing communications internally without some kind of rigor and structure and trying to funnel it through person X and Y and so on and so forth. Because there's just so much information, so many people involved, that if everybody answered every email in an inbox, that's all they do all day. So from an infrastructure perspective, it can be understandable to a certain extent. But what leadership, I think, at the senior most levels needs to do is recognize that infrastructure can build a siloed culture, and that's really not helpful for anyone. And the PIOs are in an excellent position to anticipate what some of those external questions are going to be. And even if they can be well answered, right? There could be really hard, tough questions that come from the outside or come from the political offices. And those can be really tough questions, and there might be really good answers for them. But
Right.
they wouldn't have access to those. And in the absence of information, what happens? People fill in the gaps.
Right. In your experience, how receptive are those senior leaders in hearing that tough feedback from their communications teams?
I would say there's very little reception whatsoever. Again, it would come down to the very often the curated, templated external briefings. And if people are demanding more information than that, there can be a lot of pushback. And that's where again the cultural aspect comes in, where that just doesn't become acceptable.
Why do you think that is?
Because people are naturally concerned about, I mean, protecting their environment sounds a little bit dramatic, maybe, But this is one of the issues that I've run into so many times about reporting on projects in general. Even if things are going well, if things
Hmm.
hit these little stumbling blocks, and you just look at the data, some people might say it's off track, it's going to be late, it's going to be over budget, and it might be true. But very often the project manager will try to justify, rationalize, insist that we can get it back on track, because there is a lot of that extra scrutiny on a lot of these projects, and nobody wants to be holding the bag if something goes down. So this becomes a kind of a reactive relationship where the information that's being pushed up is very often information that they want to be heard, as opposed to actual status information. Now, when you bring in PIOs or teams that aren't necessarily directly involved, then you add that extra layer of maybe not outsider, but not necessarily within the project either. So there's an extra layer of insulation that needs to happen there. Again, I really feel like culture is a big issue with a lot of these projects, and improving and increasing communications within internally will only help external, in my opinion.
All right, so let's talk about those internal steps that need to be taken. What are some of them?
So, what I'd say is kind of off the bat, in what might sound like a depressing turn, is that the infrastructure often holds it back, right? As I said, there are too many players, they're too big, there's too much oversight. The citizens will want to scrutinize too much. It's just too much, too much, too much. So that's why all of these layers of protection are naturally built in. Because on the one hand, everything were always scrutinized all the time, nothing would get done. On the other hand, of course, you don't want zero transparency either. These are public dollars. So there's that balance of, we'll give information, but make sure that it's curated. So the infrastructure is going to set it up like that. And then the culture is going to be reinforced, but like that. So what it comes down to is leadership at the individual level, at the senior most level, taking charge and just saying that this is not an acceptable state of affairs. We're all on the same team. We all want to deliver, and we're all delivering on behalf of the public. And so what we can do is start challenging, where are we exactly? The public is going to ask for these types of questions. We have to be able to give it to them. And if we're not in a position to give it to them, well, then we have to dig deeper and understand why that is. But we should be challenging ourselves first internally. And then that second layer can definitely be PIOs and comms teams providing that internal challenge, better anticipating what's going to be scrutinized. And then by the time it gets to the public, I mean, hopefully, I've always been of the belief that the best answers are addressing questions that haven't even been asked yet. And so if we're in a spot to be able to provide that information, and still, of course, be open to challenge within reason, respecting privacy, and if there are certain security concerns or something like that, sure, but we should be challenging ourselves internally, because we know that challenge is coming down the road regardless.
And so from your background and dealing with projects extremely large, when the leadership that's there, are they lacking the training to realize that they need to loop in their communications people, or are they not giving the message to the people down below saying, bring communications into this?
I think that communications does not have the profile that it deserves very often in a lot of agencies. Now there might be some agencies that behave very differently from that. From my perspective, it's often been an outward facing funnel. Now there are exceptions to that. There always will be, but I definitely believe that communications should be brought into it more. It's not about crafting the end message. It's, you know, providing that excellent lens on internal operations that we know we're going to be facing external at a certain point. They know how to look at things from an outsider's perspective, even though they're technically on the same team.
Right. And, it's always interesting when you don't get the information from a communications team, or you're not getting any communication, that void of communication. That usually is so glaring in an organization from the outside view. Of like, what are you
Yeah,
hiding? What aren't you
yeah,
telling us?
yeah. And that's where, little c conspiracies start to pop up everywhere. Is it must be a
Yeah.
complete disaster, or they're not spending it where they said they would spend it, or let's just wait. There's going to be a huge bombshell that's going to drop, and sometimes things might be chugging along really well, and the message just isn't being sold. Other times, as I said, the fact that they can't answer tough questions a finding unto itself, and that needs to be addressed. And that's not something to be hidden or protected. That's something to be confronted, and that's where bold leadership takes over and says that we are running into some problems, or we're delayed, or we need to do a little bit more in this area, and better to know it now than when the project is done and people are picking up the pieces and asking, how did you spend taxpayer dollars on something that doesn't even work?
Right. Matt, can you talk about a time when there was a communication misstep that made a bad situation worse? Do you know of any recently that you could think of?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll go back to the Phoenix project that I was just talking about there, where denial was the ruling message of the day, and then it was that everything is getting back on track, which delayed the messages further. And what that started to do as well is, I think that a lot of senior leaders started to believe it as well. And so what we just needed was a little bit more time. But as they were asking for more time, the issue was snowballing and becoming ever greater and ever greater. Another part of that communication misstep was that the anticipated savings were continuously sold without necessarily highlighting what any of the risks could have been. And so even in those early days, it was being trumpeted as an opportunity to save money. We've hit an early bump in the road, but we're going to start saving lots of money real soon. And of course, that didn't happen, and quite the opposite took effect.
Right. So, Matt, the I don't know if you've followed any of the politics that are going on here in the U.S. since you've been out the EAU. The Department of Government Efficiency has done a lot of digging into stuff, and one of them I saw stuck in my brain. I think it was Social Security and Medicaid, and the two there was some supposed to be money that was supposed to be sent on software to help those connect better and and be able to speak to each other, because I guess right now they don't. And the dollar amount started out at I want to say $400 million, and it's now like 7 or 8 billion dollars right now of what they've spent to try and get this project to work over the last, I want to say, close to 20 years.
Okay.
What kind of misstep
Okay.
is that?
So, I'm not familiar with that one perfectly, but it's not uncommon. And if we're going back 20 years, and this is, I guess, maybe stepping outside of the PIO aspect a little bit. If we're going back 20 years or so, it took a long time for public services around the world to finally come to the realization that just buying software and modifying it as needed is a lot cheaper and generally more successful than building it from scratch on the inside. And as I said, that's a very unfortunately recent transition, within the last 10 years or so. And there's still some that still insist on doing it. And nothing generally comes to fruition when they're built in house, because the demands keep changing. And I mean, just grab a software company off the top of my head, Microsoft. What are they doing? They're building software for billions and billions of people and organizations. So they have lots of opportunities for things to go wrong, and then have great feedback to fix those things. If it's a team building something once for one group for the first time, it becomes a huge hill to climb. And it's not to say that it can't be done. It's just it rarely is done so effectively. And we often see this impact, and it takes a long time. And then at a certain point, the sunk cost fallacy comes in, and the leaders say, well, we've spent all this money. We can't give up now. We've got to finish it. And they keep throwing good money after bad.
Right. It's an interesting thought. I was thinking about this several years ago when I was working for my, local government, and I'd gone to try and purchase software, and they're like, we can do that for you. We can build that. And this was an IT director. And I said, okay, well, what's the time frame? Well, this is not that difficult. This is a simple database with merging finance into it. I'm like, okay, what's the time frame? And they're like, about 6 months. And I'm like, okay, I can wait on that. 2 years later, I got something, and it was nowhere near what I needed.
Hmm.
And the first
Hmm.
comment out of the IT director's mouth about it was that he didn't have time to work on it full time because he had IT director responsibilities to do,
Busy guy.
which which is exactly what I was thinking. Like you said, in house versus going outside and purchasing software that's been means tested in multiple organizations, from small to extremely large.
Yeah. And And a hugely important factor that's rarely considered as well is it's market tested from the user experience, right? If these companies are pumping out software that nobody likes or nobody knows how to use, or it changes too often, or it crashes all the time, what happens? People stop buying it. And so they either market correct or they go out of business. And that's the kind of real constant stress testing that any internal IT department could never face. They would never have that opportunity to keep practicing and practicing and practicing on the same type of thing with millions of different experiences being fed back to them. So they're immediately at a disadvantage, but it feels cheaper at the beginning because often we're just talking about salary and a few consultant dollars, but it rarely stays cheap.
Right. Oh, no, of course not. Matthew, in your experience now, you're out on the UA, and what kind of work are you doing out there at the UA?
Yeah. So when I left the federal public service, I started coaching senior public servants on project risk management. As I said, I didn't want to start focusing on the folks who know risk. I wanted to start focusing on those who could really effect project change. And one of the trade-offs that I've always seen, the internal communication blockages between the risk teams and the project delivery teams is, risk means let's reduce our ambition, let's scale it back, let's protect ourselves, let's make sure we don't stick our necks out too far. When, in my view, risk actually should protect that ambition. It should be, let's look at the boldest goals we can possibly accomplish, what gets in the way down the road. And that's what a risk is. That's all it is. It's not some clinical definition with all these templates and these whiz bang live action graphs and everything else. But when we boil it down to its purest form, it's what will get in the way of me achieving what I want to do. And if we take it from that perspective, then let's do those moonshots. But let's be informed so that if something really bad happens, we're aware of it and we probably have got a plan in place. But it doesn't mean let's just stay at home so that we don't get in a car accident.
Yeah, that never helped anybody, did it? Innovation
No,
was never done doing that, right?
no, exactly. Exactly.
All right, Matthew, do you have one piece of advice one piece of advice to give to PIOs trying to move from being reactive to strategic communicators as it relates to a project a very large project that's being done in the agency?
Absolutely. So talked a lot about leadership across this conversation. We can all demonstrate leadership in our own positions. And I would really strongly urge all PIOs, if they're involved in communications for any projects, to get as involved proactively, insert themselves into these conversations as much as possible. If there's a quarterly steering committee or oversight committee, try to get on that. Try to talk to the project managers, get this information ahead of time and start asking those questions. And you know what? In that informal environment, especially if you can meet with the project leaders outside of these formal structures and start peppering them with questions and just say, just devil's advocate, I know somebody's going to ask this question. And then you can start to, in a very friendly way, start to ask the real hard questions. And hopefully there's some answers, but if there aren't, then that becomes a feedback loop right there in real time to the project manager. And again, the less formal it is, the more of an entry they're going to have to do this. But I do think that leadership can be from within. And to be completely frank, if more PIOs did that, it would really, really do the projects a great service, providing that early, informal, kind of consequence-free type of challenge so that they can start asking, is everything really going all right? Or am I just trying to craft a message, which eventually will get untold?
Right. Matthew, is there a question I should have asked? And if so, how would you have answered it?
Well, the only question I would offer, or at least I'll offer an answer to a question in my head, is that there are lots of unseen problems and issues with lots of projects that we very often just try to go towards those formulaic risk type of responses, and that's often what we're feeding to PIOs. What I think every project manager, every project leader, and every PIO needs to ask is, what are those did I? Okay, sorry. I just thought my camera blinked there for a second. So
Go
what
ahead. You're
every
good.
okay, good. What every project leader, senior leader, and PIO needs to ask is, Can we do a proper gut check on this project? Are we following these prescriptive risks a little bit too much? And a bunch of risks that I've encountered so many times never ever appear in any risk list for any of these projects. And again, a risk is not something on the side that we just fill out for compliance sake. It is something that will block the project. And so that's what led to me to develop. I developed a health check for senior leaders, which goes through the top 10 kind of unseen risks that seem to face every single project, but never really get addressed in any meaningful sense by the project teams. PIOs can grab this and apply it and ask those questions. And of course, senior leaders and senior project leaders can do the same. It's available on the website for free, theriskInsider.com/health check.
And I'll add that into the show notes.
Perfect.
Matthew, let's change this up here. Let's go to some rapid fire questions.
Okay.
Here we go. Texting or talking?
I'm sorry?
Texting or talking?
I want to say talking. I really do. I miss those days. But if I'm being honest, I default to texting.
There you go. Movies or books?
Both. Honestly, I'm a big consumer of both.
Coffee, tea, or energy drink?
Probably in that order. A big coffee drinker, drink tea somewhat often. Never drink energy drinks unless it's an all-nighter.
Adult drink of choice?
Red wine, probably. It depends. I love a pint, but red wine's what I have at home.
Nice. Cats or dogs?
Dogs, 100%.
Your most favorite go-to karaoke song, if you have one?
Oh, goodness. I don't know if I have one. I'll just say the last time I did karaoke, I did Piano Man. That's the best I got.
There you go. What would be your superpower if you had one?
Flying.
If you could instantly become an expert in one thing, what would it be?
Maybe piano or guitar.
Ask permission or beg for forgiveness?
Definitely the latter.
What's your favorite way to relax? Yes. What is your favorite way to relax after a long day?
I'll go for a walk or have a glass of wine with my wife.
What place would you most like to travel to?
Probably Galapagos.
Okay. Who would you choose if you could have coffee with any historical figure, living or dead?
Wow. Maybe Julius Caesar, just to see if he has any idea what was coming next.
There you go. Final thoughts, Matthew. What key points would you like the listeners and viewers to take from today's interview?
It's that the best way we can deal with any crises or any projects that are going off the rails is deal with them proactively. We can't rely on the machinery. The machinery is only going to slow it down and block it. It comes down to individual leadership. I've seen firsthand that leadership can make a big difference, and I'd love to see more of them take the steering wheel.
As we wrap this up, is there a piece of wisdom or a motto that you live by?
Well, I'll circle back to what we talked about, that ambition can drive a heck of a lot. I really firmly believe, I think government can become too big, but I think that it has a very firm role in the world. There are things that government can do that private enterprise it's a gap that they just can't fill. And I'd love to see more ambition within the federal government or not just federal government, sorry, just any agency, any public agency to think as big as possible. Just make sure that we're dealing with the challenges before they even come.
Matthew, how can people best reach you if they want to connect, follow up, or potentially hire you?
Yeah, the probably the easiest way is what I mentioned, theriskInsider.com/health check. If you download that, not only will you get some great tips on diagnosing your own project, but my email will be there, instructions to book a call if you wanted to. So everything is right there. So theriskInsider.com/health check.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Matthew. And I'll add all that in the show notes as well. Matthew, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you so much. It's been a lot.
Yep, it has been. Thank you.